Hi, welcome to my channel, Reader Woman. My name's Judy, and let's talk books. In particular, let's talk Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. I have been rereading it. I've read it so many times. I kind of read it and, just enjoy the language. However, Steve Donoghue had a read-along this last month in March, and he had a very provocative ending to his final video. Was quite provocative to me and to my interpretation of what we read, and I would like to talk about that. To let you know, generalized. I will link in his video so you can see exactly what he's talking about. But basically he's saying that the two main characters, Mrs. Bennett, the mother of the Bennett sisters, and Lady Catherine de Burgh are not fleshed out the way he feels they should be. They're not given their due. They're more made kind of villains of the story, and I would like to talk about that. He said it much more eloquently than I did, but a couple of things. In December, I got to see Pride and Prejudice, the play. It was put on by a local university here where I live, and it was a wonderful production. For the first time, I really saw how Mrs. Bennett is an amazing, humorous character. The actress who played her was so into the role and did such a great job. And for the first time, I found myself having sympathy for her. And just like Steve Donoghue in the program, the author of the play, along with Jane Austen, but she mentioned that this was serious business, what was going on, and that this was Mrs. Bennett marrying off her daughters. That was her #1 job, and that's what she was trying to do. So let's talk about Mrs. Bennett. I feel that the Bennett daughters, in particular the two oldest, Jane and Lizzie, definitely saw firsthand a marriage of unequal partners. As Jane Austen writes, I'm sorry I don't have the quotes, I will get to be more on top of it, but as she wrote, Mr. Bennett his fancy was caught by a pretty face, and that was Mrs. Bennett. And I'm assuming you know the story. This is total spoilers. I'm talking about theories and ideas about the book. This isn't anything other than that. So if you haven't read the book and you don't want to know what's going on, you would need to move on. But for me, Mr. Bennett is a great character. He's likable. He's funny. He's sarcastic and ironic. And obviously, ultimately, not a good enough father. And the problem in the Bennett marriage between a literary thinking gentleman and a pretty flighty, just interested in the things around her and her people, not issues or anything like that. That was a marriage that the Bennett girls grew up in, a very unequal marriage. And I think that has to be taken into consideration. And in fact, you see that duplicated when Charlotte Lucas marries Mr. Collins. you see that's perhaps more extreme, but you see a sensible, likable woman who doesn't have the attributes to have naturally caught a better spouse, married to a buffoon, someone who really just, you shudder at the thought that he's the local pastor. He's officious. He has no kindness or sympathy in him. He is basically status oriented and really could care less about anything else. So you have these shadow players. So for Lizzie, when she visits Charlotte later in the book, she understands her friend's future. And that, I think, has to be a reality. Now also Jane Austen, this was her first novel. She's young. I mean, she died so young. You can't, I feel like I cannot discount that is also a critical part of what we're reading. Unfortunately, you know, I think in her later books, she's trying to explore new and different fields. But for Pride and Prejudice, it's you know, kind of a regurgitation of Sense and Sensibility in a lot of ways. So Mrs. Bennett, yes, she is rightfully concerned that her daughters find good homes, or husbands who are going to provide good homes for them. But I have to say, her elation upon her youngest daughter, Lydia, who is barely 16, 15, 16, married to a man of no reputation, who has shown that he has no reputation, who has been forced to marry this young girl, and yet she rejoices. That just shows a total lack of sense of any kind of balance. And I think it's justified. I don't think, you know, in some ways she's written it as a caricature, but not in every way. And I wanted to be clear about that, because on the stage, Mrs. Bennett was very, very funny, and yet you completely understood why Mr. Bennett kept his study, his library door closed. He had to have that buffer between him and this woman who was just full of emotions and full of nonsense. Neither one of them was doing a very good job of parenting. For the two oldest daughters to be so balanced, you know, you could just say in some ways the younger sisters are kind of caricatures to a certain extent. You know, but at the same token, there's that lack of being an adult, particularly after Mr. Bingley, Mr. Darcy, and the party at Netherfield Hall leaves for London without any note or goodbye. And, you know, instead of Jane being sick in bed, it's Mrs. Bennett. You know, the girls are having to mother their own mother. And I think that that is a type of person that existed back then and exists today. And particularly for Jane and Elizabeth Bennet, they are looking for a marriage that is more equal. And obviously, Lizzie in particular. I mean, I can only imagine if she had been forced into marriage with Mr. Collins, how angry and bitter and cynical a woman she would have grown to be. With her liveliness and spiritedness, to be tied to such a person would have kind of destroyed her character. Then you look at Lady Catherine de Burgh. One thing that Steve Donoghue said was that she was just looking at her nephew, Mr. Darcy, as, you know, and he was in that society. He was on a very high plane, you know, on the whole Richter scale. He was more towards the top. However, I don't know that, okay, let me step back. He makes the point that the Lady Catherine's position to Elizabeth in confronting her towards the end, saying, "You shall not marry my nephew, because this is too unequal of marriage." So you're talking about another way in which couples are unequal. So one partner has more money than the other. One partner has a different personality from the other. So for Lady Catherine, there is definitely a point at which she's right. Elizabeth is not of his echelon. She is not on his level when it comes to economics. And very likely there were members of his family who were not going to accept her. They were going to look down on her. However, I think it was taking it too far to look at Elizabeth as being equal to Mr. Wickham. Lizzie is a daughter of a gentleman. The estate isn't huge. It doesn't afford them a London life at all. However, they are very respected in the neighborhood, and she's definitely a lady. Whereas I think Wickham is a scoundrel. And you pity, in the long run, Lydia, because basically she almost might not have, ultimately it's not going to really matter whether she married him or not. He's going to ruin her. She's already ruined. She was ruined to begin with. She was a flighty schoolgirl who never had limits put on her, and she was just left to her own devices, and seeing her older sisters and feeling like she could do any and everything they could. You know, she was just perfectly happy getting married, or having a man forced to marry her because they were living in sin. For that generation, for that age, all right? I'm not saying morally today, but within the parameters of the Regency romance. Pretty much, you might as well become a courtesan or a prostitute if you have been living with a man without the sanctity of marriage. So, that being said, I do not find it equal. And in fact, it is pathetic how Mrs. Bennett rejoices in the fact that her youngest daughter has married this reprobate, Mr. Wickham. It's necessity calls for it, but there is nothing to celebrate there. And Lady Catherine de Burgh is, while she may look at Lizzie in that kind of way, that is not at all an accurate portrayal. Because while Mr. Darcy isn't getting a wife with a dowry, with a large dowry or anything like that, he is getting a wife who is going to enlarge his life, who is going to make his life more comfortable, more human. They're going to connect in a way that is going to sweeten his life, as well as enriching, and also yeah, as well as enriching Lizzie's life as well. The Lady Catherine de Burgh character has never struck me as being totally realistic, in the sense of how she's written. I think the character itself, yes, I understand, people of such, high standing within their society, and they know it, and they're letting everyone else know about it. I get that. However, I don't think that as a character she works that well. She just doesn't. In one sense, she's there just to let Darcy know that Lizzie has changed her mind. Because the minute that Lady Catherine gets no satisfaction from Lizzie, she then goes and talks to her nephew and telling him that he cannot marry this woman. And, and at that point he knows that Lizzie hasn't said that she will not marry him, so he goes and tries again to propose. So I don't know that I think the character is as well realized as she could have been. However, I do think that Mrs. Bennett is a pretty well-rounded character. I just think that her flaws are fairly realistic. And I wonder too, I wonder about Jane Austen. Because in reality, there are few happy couples. There's the hope of happiness at the end of these books, but for modeling, they're kind of rare. You don't see them regularly. I mean, you're in the middle of the book before you meet the Gardners. And really, I think their marriage is about the only one I can think of in Pride and Prejudice that stands out as a happy union. So, yeah, I think though that at least the older Bennett girls, I'll say it once again, are looking for more of an equal match, temperament-wise, and are trying to figure out a way to make their lives happier and more balanced than what their parents were. And I wonder about Jane Austen's family. I mean, was that her experience with her father and mother? I know she was devoted to her father, who died early, and she ended up living with her mother and sister for the rest of her life, very unhappily for a while in Bath. So, I mean, these are questions we'll never have answered, but I did want to say that while the necessity for marrying your daughters off and for providing not just a future for themselves, but also possibly for yourself, because the minute your husband dies, you no longer have a home, which is something that we saw in Sense and Sensibility. It's a terrible thing. It's a terrible thing to have to give up your home to someone else. And I'm not quite sure how easy it was to transfer, from this whole patriarchal thing of going to the first male in the family. I'm not quite sure how easy that would have been. I don't know. I haven't studied that. Mr. Donoghue thought it was fairly simple. And if, Mr. Bennett had been a little bit more proactive and also a better father, trying to take care of his wife and family, that might have happened. Maybe, maybe not. But I know one thing. Both Jane and Lizzie were hoping that their father outlived their mother, as Jane had to move out of they had to sell Netherfield because they couldn't be that close to Mrs. Bennett, and I could understand. And I don't know. I've always thought the sisters were, they were well balanced in the sense of, well, they were unbalanced. I'm sorry, they were unbalanced. You have all this beauty and good sense and vivacious charisma, and then you end up with Mary in the middle, who tries to be like her father and be very erudite, but who ends up just boring people. You know, Kitty, I think, probably married well. I think that with the help of her older sisters, you know, raising her to understand how she needed to be in society. And she was fairly pliable as a character. I think that she probably did make a very happy marriage down the road with somebody. But yeah, I'm not quite sure who would have ended up with Mrs. Bennett. So I just had these thoughts. I had to get them off my mind, and I hope somebody finds it of interest. So keep reading, and I'll be back. Bye.